Welcome to another video for biology. In this video we're going to be taking a look at useful genetic vocabulary, and this is part 2, continuing on from part 1. We're going to be finishing up and looking at a dihybrid cross. In the previous video we looked at a Punnett square and how various or actually one particular characteristic gets passed on from generation to generation, and we were looking at this as it pertained to the color of peas. Okay, so we looked at the genetics for color, but this also works for other physical characteristics, such as the surface of a pea. For example, is the pea going to be a smooth rounded, or will it be a rough rounded or a wrinkled pea? So we're going to be looking at how this particular allele, so if it's a wrinkled pea, it's going to be a recessive. Okay, so this is a recessive characteristic, and then the dominant allele is the smooth. All right, so let's see how this gene, how we can use the Punnett square to see the probability of whether the pea is going to be a smooth or a wrinkled pea. So let's say that we cross these two peas, two homozygous peas, homozygous recessive for wrinkled and homozygous dominant for smooth. So as you can tell from, if you remember from the previous video and how we looked at the Punnett square, we look at the pea on the right, we see that it only has two alleles to contribute, and those are the two dominant alleles. And then the one on our left has two recessive alleles to contribute. So we look at each quadrant and how that ends up. We see we have all four heterozygous or hybrids. Okay, so even though they're hybrids, even though you have a recessive gene in there, you're only going to have the dominant characteristic be expressed. So now what happens when we cross these? This is the F1 generation now. What happens if we cross two of these? So let's see what would happen now. Now you see here that each P has a dominant allele and a recessive allele to contribute. All right. So just also, side note here, if you want to see how I actually filled out each of these quadrants, please go back to Useful Genetic Vocabulary Part 1, because I break down how I get these different combinations in each quadrant. Alright, so I can see here that it's a bit different than my previous set. So here I have a homozygous dominant, and it's going to be round, and a hybrid heterozygous. Okay. And then on the third quadrant I have a homozygous recessive. So now in this case I'm actually going to have the wrinkled gene or the wrinkled phenotype be expressed. So I have a 3-to-1 ratio here of smooth to wrinkled peas. Now let's take a look at a dihybrid cross. Okay, so far we've been dealing with monohybrid crosses, which refer to just one characteristic, and that's been the color of the pea. Okay, now we want to combine these two, and we want to have a dihybrid cross where we find the probability of two characteristics being expressed, and those two characteristics are whether the pea will be wrinkled or smooth, or what color it's going to be. Okay, so this can get pretty involved, and that's what this video is for. This is why I dedicated just one complete video to it, because it can get pretty lengthy, and you may have to watch this over more than once. And again, this is only a dihybrid cross. This is for finding the combination or the probability of whether the pea is going to be, wrinkled, smooth, or yellow or green. And it can be any of these various combinations. So for this, I'm going to find two homozygous peas. I'm going to find homozygous recessive for color and for surface. Okay, so first the color. Okay, so the color, we already know that green is the recessive trait, so that's going to be two lowercase y's, and then the dominant trait, homozygous dominant, will be two capital Y's. Okay, now the surface. Okay, the surface for wrinkled is again recessive, so it's going to be a homozygous recessive. So our green pea is a green wrinkled pea. That's a double homozygous recessive combination, and then it's going to be capital R for smooth homozygous dominant on our right. Alright, so we have two homozygous peas, right? So let's cross these peas and see what we end up with, okay? Now, if you recall back to the previous video, if I want to know how many possible combinations I'm going to have, I first want to know how many components each species, each of these P's is going to contribute. And each P is going to contribute 4 possible alleles, right? So if I look on my left one, I can either contribute two lowercase y's or two lowercase r's, and that's 4 possible alleles I can contribute. And on the right, I can also contribute 4 possible alleles, giving me a possibility of 16 possible outcomes. Okay, so I can mix match each of these alleles, okay, in different ways, and I will end up with 16 possible combinations of alleles. All right, so, and I express this by having a quadrant with 16 squares, okay, and my different combinations for each. So this set of combinations here refers to this for these two P's combining together, and likewise for these 4, okay? So that's 16 possible outcomes. So let's take a look at what these outcomes can be. Let's look at the first quadrant on our top left. I notice here that there are 2 capital Y's, so that's going to be a dominant for color, dominant homozygous, and it's also going to be dominant homozygous for the surface. So that's going to be a yellow rounded P. Let's take a look at the second. Again, homozygous for color, homozygous dominant, and this time it's going to be heterozygous for the surface, but again I have that dominant allele, so it's still going to be what surface now? If it's a dominant allele, okay, I hope you guessed rounded. Okay, and this time I have a heterozygous for color, but I still have that dominant allele, so you know it's going to be yellow. And then I have a homozygous dominant for surface, so it's definitely going to be round. Okay, and this time it's heterozygous for both color and for the surface, and it's still going to be yellow rounded. Now you'll notice on that top row that I have different combinations of alleles, right, from homozygous to heterozygous, but because I have the dominant allele being expressed in each one of those, for each one of those characteristics, they're all going to be homozygous, or they're all going to be the same phenotype. Different genotypes, but all the same phenotype. Okay? All right. Let's see if we get anything more interesting in the second row. Now, let me show you a quicker way to do this. Instead of going one by one per se, let's take a look at this particular row right here. I notice here that I have heterozygous, I have a capital Y and a lowercase r. So what do we have to contribute in this row? In this row, I notice that there's going to be, all of them are going to have a capital Y. Since I know they're all going to have a capital Y, I know that they're all going to be yellow. No matter what the other row, no matter what this top row of Y's contributes, I know because I have a capital Y in every single one of these, they're all going to be yellow. Okay? Right? Even if it's homozygous for the first 2 and heterozygous for the second 2, but it's still all going to be yellow in terms of phenotype. Now let's take a look at our surface alleles. Now this one gets a little interesting because for that second row I have only recessive lowercase r's. So let's see what the the next row will contribute. Look at this. This is interesting because I notice here that now I have 2 homozygous recessive for surface. So all of them are going to be yellow. I've determined that already, but they're not all going to be smooth. Okay, that one's going to be yellow rounded. The second one will be, take a second to guess what it'll be. Hopefully you guessed yellow wrinkled. And then the third. Okay, so I'm going to pause a little bit so you can guess the next one. Yes, hopefully you guessed yellow wrinkled. Okay, all right. Let's do the same technique with the third row. Okay, so I notice here that I have all recessive Y's to contribute. Okay, now what will the next row contribute? What will our columns contribute? So you'll notice on the far right, I have 2 recessive Y's, right? 2 homozygous recessives. So the 2 on the left will be yellow, but the 2 on the right are going to be green, right? So I know what the colors are going to be, but what will the surface be? Okay, so I noticed that they're all going to have a dominant R. So that automatically tells me right there that they're all going to be rounded, smooth, rounded. So even though there'll be different colors, they're still going to be they're all going to have the same characteristic of having this smooth surface. All right, so the next row, the last row, is recessive Y's. Okay, now let's see what else will be contributed. All right, so I can see here I have the same situation that I had in that third row. I'm going to have the far right being green and the far left being yellow. Now let's take a look and see what our surface is going to be. So I have all recessive being passed on from that row. So let's see what the columns will contribute. Interesting. So I noticed that those two are recessive for our surface. Okay, so recessive meaning homozygous recessive for the surface, meaning they're going to be wrinkled. Right? So I'll have a yellow smooth, yellow wrinkled, green smooth, and green wrinkled. Okay, so I hope that this has been helpful for you in trying to figure out how much or what the possibilities are for the various phenotypes being expressed. So to close our discussion here, now that we finally have all the different phenotypes that are that could be expressed and the different genotypes, we're going to take a look at the ratios. Okay, we want to take a look at the ratios of each possible phenotype that could be expressed. So if I want to look first at the dominant phenotypes, which would be the yellow rounded, and I notice here that there's 9 of them. And so if I combine these two homozygous P's, out of the 16 possible combinations, 9 of them are going to be yellow rounded. Okay, and then 3 of them will be yellow wrinkled. Okay, so my ratio will be 9-3, and then 3 green, and 1 homozygous recessive, which would be green and wrinkled P. So then my final ratio would be a 9-3 to 3-1 ratio. Okay, out of the 16 possible outcomes. Okay, well that does it for our discussion for a dihybrid cross, and that also concludes our useful genetic vocabulary. Good luck in your studying.